Hey, U.S. history students, how are you guys doing today? Now that we're back officially from spring break, technically, you guys probably heard the news that we are not going to be going back to school this year due to the shelter in place orders. So, this makes the rest of the year a little bit complicated. As I record this, I still don't know what that means for the second semester, what that means for grading, for what are the expectations. But what I'm going to do in the meantime until we find out more is I'm just going to keep um, putting up as many lessons as I can. That doesn't mean I'm going to be filling up a whole bunch of content on your feed here, but I want to cover at least some of the things that we would have talked about if we were still in school. One of the things that everyone loves the most about history is learning about World War II and America's role in it, especially. So I thought it would be good if I devote this week to talking about America's role in one of the greatest crises that the world has ever known, and and how America's entry in it changed the war. So last year, when you were sophomores in world history, you probably learned about the European side of the war and how it got started with the rise of extreme fascism in Germany and Italy and Japan's ambitions to take over an empire in Asia. So I don't really want to repeat anything that you might have learned about last year, um, except just to say that obviously after World War One and Germany's defeat, one of the things that the German people turned to that would help them to sort of find relief for many of the problems that plagued Germany at this time was to turn to political leaders who promised to make everything better in Germany. And of course, in Germany, that meant at the time Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, who were a relatively small group at the time, but they grew in popularity as things went from bad to worse in Germany during the Great Depression in the 1920s and 30s. We see the same thing happen in Italy under the rise of the dictator Benito Mussolini. Italy also had suffered greatly economically because of World War One and the Great Depression. And then in Japan, we start to see that Japan, as an industrial power, has ambitions also to claim an empire, just like the Western countries of Britain and France and the United States had claimed their empires. Japan was looking for its place in the sun as well, and felt that Asia was rightfully their area, their sphere. So this kind of makes the situation ripe for a massive world war, since all three countries, Germany, Italy, and Japan, had plans to take over a certain area in the world. Italy wanted North Africa and the Mediterranean. Germany wants all of Europe, and including, of course, Russia. And Japan wants Asia. Where does the United States fit into this? Well, you guys might recall that America at the time wanted to remain neutral. World War I had not been a great experience. Most people come out of World War I feeling pretty disappointed in war itself and how horrible the whole situation was. And so Americans, for the most part, had decided that they wanted to stay out of Europeans' affairs. And the country remained neutral. But today's question is, how neutral were we really? After all, America is in the Great Depression. War could do something to pull America out of the Depression, and FDR was no dummy about that. He knew. So, and also what was happening in Europe at the time was really kind of scary, right? You've got Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, who are planning to seemingly split the world between the two of them, and then Japan in the Pacific. It seemed like these three men were going to hold, almost the entire world in their hands. And it was really, and what Hitler was doing as well was really frightening, especially as stories from the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe were coming out. And we'll talk also about a little bit about America's role in the Holocaust as well, or not, our role as bystanders, obviously. So I'm going to put an assignment on Pearl Harbor, which is the event that draws America into the war, up on Google Classroom that I'm going to attach to this video. and I'm going to have you guys read it and then answer questions like I have been doing. But I want to talk a little bit about this question: how neutral was America right before World War II? Everyone, I think, knows that the event that draws America into World War II is the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but it didn't necessarily come completely out of nowhere. At least as historians, we tend to know that there were some warnings ahead of time and perhaps also some motivation to join the war. So let's look at American neutrality before World War II actually draws America in. Okay, so after World War I, the post-World War I world, like Americans were really discouraged. Even though we did pretty well in that war, and even though the economy in the 1920s was doing well, the 1930s brought the Depression, of course, and Americans were discouraged not only by the bad economy, but they saw that in Europe there was a rise in totalitarianism. Dictatorships like Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin in the Soviet Union. And these dictators have a tendency to get things done. Unlike in America where we have a democracy. And while FDR was really popular because of his New Deal, it didn't actually put a stop to the Depression. The Depression continued on. And a lot of Americans start to see that in Europe, dictators, they're accomplishing things. Now, this is not necessarily a good thing. The reason why dictators can accomplish things is usually because they rule through fear and oppression and terror and autocracy. And while the countries themselves seemed to be doing better, the quality of life of the people in those countries was not good. But some Americans looked at dictators and they were like, that's interesting that they seem to be accomplishing things that we're not accomplishing here. Like they're actually putting people to work. What they don't tell you, though, is that a lot of these people who were being put to work in Germany were working for like practically no money. However, it looked on the outside like Hitler really had it together as far as putting people to work in Germany and bringing Germany back from the brink of failure. Another thing that they were really discouraged by was the failure of the League of Nations. I mean, America hadn't even joined the League of Nations. You might remember that, but Americans at least did hope that the League of Nations could do something to prevent war, and it wasn't working. Germany had already started invading some countries in Europe, like Austria and Czechoslovakia, and Italy invaded Ethiopia. The Japanese had already invaded China in an area called Manchuria. And these were all things that were not supposed to happen, that the League of Nations was supposed to put a stop to, but the League of Nations couldn't do anything. So many Americans are like discouraged from just the fact that, this peace that was supposed to be created after World War I obviously is not lasting very long at all. Also, many Americans were kind of disgusted with the way that a lot of weapons manufacturers had profited from World War I. So many Americans lost family members, men in World War I, and a lot of them thought it was kind of gross that these weapons and gun manufacturers had become really, really successful and profitable off of that. So this brings up the whole issue of war profiteering, and is it morally right or ethical for a company to make money from war? I don't have an answer for you. I want you guys to figure, you should have that one figured out for yourselves. But one thing we do know for sure is that when World War II does finally start for America, it will put an end to the Depression. So prior to America entering the war, about 6 years before World War II sucks America in 1941, America had passed a series of laws called the Neutrality Acts starting in 1935. And these were actually supported by FDR himself. He had been a proponent. He had actually banned the sale of weapons to any nation that was at war at the time. And in October of 1935, when Italy invaded Ethiopia, America does not really make much of a statement on that. And this was pretty scary when Italy invades Ethiopia because it was an act of retaliation. Italy had tried to invade Ethiopia once before in the 1800s and failed because Ethiopians were actually armed with similar machine guns that the Italians had. So when Mussolini does this, it's seen as an act of revenge and pettiness, but on a really violent, brutal scale. And a lot of people around the world, in fact, were disgusted by this. And the king of Ethiopia at the time, Haile Selassie, even made a speech in front of the League of Nations begging for help. Nothing could be done to help them. So FDR did support this idea of internationalism, though. FDR wants, his big concern is the economy. What's good for the economy is business, trade. So he believes that we got to keep businesses going. We got to keep trade going because this is good for peace and prosperity between nations. More trade hopefully means less war, although this isn't going to work out so well for World War II. But instead, the aggressive acts from the Axis continue. You've got the Italy, Germany, Japan axis that had formed prior, in the 1930s. And 2 years after Italy invaded Ethiopia, Japan invades China. And it was a brutal invasion. Today, historians call it as the Rape of Nanjing, the Forgotten Holocaust, the millions and millions of Chinese civilians who died at the hands of Japanese soldiers when they invaded was horrifying. There were American journalists who were in China at the time who sent pictures and stories about what was going on. This prompted FDR to sell weapons to China anyway, despite the Neutrality Acts. So you can see that very early on, we broke our own Neutrality Acts. The President of the United States broke the Neutrality Acts to sell weapons to countries that needed to defend themselves against this axis of Japan, Italy, and Germany. 3 years later, in December of 1940, America passes what's called the Lend-Lease Act, which is actually totally in contrast to the Neutrality Acts, because this law allowed the United States to sell weapons to any nation that was vital to the defense of the United States. If you look at the wording of that law, by December of 1940, there was only one country that could have possibly applied to, and that was Great Britain. Because to the defense of the U.S. means to the defense of democracy. And by December of 1940, all of Europe had already been invaded by Germany except for Great Britain. So basically, this basically is a kind of clouded way of saying that America could totally sell weapons to Britain. Now, at this time, he also wants to do something about all of these German submarines and Japanese submarines or German submarines specifically in the Atlantic Ocean. So he basically drafts, if you look at this map right here, in this picture, it's kind of small, this map where he says that the United States has the right to defend this hemispheric defense zone. He claims that the Western Hemisphere is neutral. This is a European war, and Japanese war too, but a European war for the most part. And he says that since the Western Hemisphere, that means the Americas, is neutral, the United States Navy has every right to patrol the Western Atlantic. So this side, the American side of the Atlantic Ocean would be patrolled by American submarines and American naval ships. But what these naval ships were doing was actually reporting the locations of all German submarines to the British. That's obviously not neutral if we're reporting, the location of German subs to the British. So already at this point too, the United States was breaking its own neutrality code. So it becomes pretty evident that we really weren't that neutral. And with good reason. Hitler was a monster, and he was on his way to taking over the world. And America found that it was important to defend democracy and freedom, and that meant defending Britain and also France, which had already surrendered to the Nazis by that point. So he takes it a step further, and in August of 1941, so this is roughly about 4 or 5 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt decides to meet with Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And Churchill had actually been begging FDR to get involved in the war for a couple of years now, ever since the war started. But ever since France surrendered, actually, Churchill had been asking FDR for American involvement. And FDR could not do that because the United States would never back him up. Congress would never support something like that, at least not unless America had a good reason to enter the war. But FDR still wants to support Great Britain, so he and Churchill meet on an ocean liner somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And they draft what's called the Charter, the Atlantic Charter, and it's basically a promise that the United States would commit to the defense of democracy. It's a very vague term, and it's purposely left that way. It's made to be vague because it's not necessarily a declaration of war. It's not an official alliance with any country. It just means the defense of democracy. Again, that was Britain. Britain was the one country that had not yet capitulated or surrendered to Germany at this point. The very next month, in September of 1941, a German submarine fired on an American destroyer that happened to be spying on it. So we also know that American ships were spying on the Germans at this time. So this German sub shoots down this American ship. As a result, FDR orders a shoot on sight policy, basically saying if to any American naval ship, if you see a German submarine, shoot it. We're not at war with Germany, but it was definitely a hint, hint, wink, wink. We weren't at war, but we pretty much were at war with Germany at this point. Again, this is even before America officially joins the war. The very next month, in October of 1941, Germany bombed another American ship, the Reuben James, and this killed 100 sailors. Again, we weren't officially at war with Germany yet, but it is coming. And then the big one happens. On December 7th, 1941, the American naval fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, was bombed by Japan. Now, it's interesting to note that we had been very preoccupied with Germany, right? All of these other events that are happening, August, September, October, this is all having to do with Germany and helping Britain in Europe against Germany. And yet, here in December comes the attack from the Japanese. Now, why did this happen? Well, most historians agree that the reason why Japan attacks the United States at this time was because the United States had also, besides, shoot down sight policies against German subs, the United States had also implemented a policy of blocking gasoline trade to Japan. The reason is that Japan is an island, and most of the territories in the Pacific that Japan was invading and conquering were also islands. What do you need to conquer an island? You need airplanes, and airplanes need fuel. So America had basically choked off the supply line of fuel to Japan's Air Force, to Japan's planes. And Japan had actually resented that. Obviously, this made them very angry and had demanded that America lift the trade embargo against them for fuel. And America obviously rejects that notion entirely and keeps trying to cut off the supply line of fuel to Japan. In an act of retaliation, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, destroying much of America's fleet that was stationed there. So here's an image from that day, from that attack. As you guys know, a couple thousand Americans died in that attack. Most were military, but some were civilians. And it was, as President Roosevelt would later call it, a day which will live in infamy. The very next day, FDR asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan, which he got. So we officially declared war on Japan the next day. And the day after that, Germany declared war on the United States. And the United States has a unique role in the war because most countries were fighting in one theater of the war. By theater, I mean the European theater or the Pacific theater. So like Britain, for example, was pretty much only fighting in Europe. France was only fighting in Europe. Germany was only fighting in Europe. Japan was only fighting in the Pacific, and so on. America is suddenly spread all over the place, right? We're spread pretty thin. We find ourselves simultaneously fighting the Japanese and the Germans and Italians all at once. We're also faced with the impossible task of trying to take away the land, the empires that Germany and Japan had tried to conquer, right? So how are we supposed to do something like this? Well, the good news is everybody goes to work right away. Men enlist men enlist voluntarily to defend America after this attack, and then pretty soon there's also a draft. Women go to work in factories. America's industry is booming, and just like that, almost overnight, the Depression is over. So with this, I'm going to leave you guys with an assignment in Google Classroom. You guys are going to read an article from a book called Don't Know Much About History. And it's an article about Pearl Harbor. You guys will read the article and answer some of these questions. There's also going to be a little timeline there about all the events that led up to Pearl Harbor. And I want you guys to tell me, how neutral do you think America really was? Do you think that the United States possibly knew ahead of time that the Japanese were planning an attack on Pearl Harbor, but allowed it to happen so that we would have a reason to get into the war, thus ending the Depression and also saving the world from this trio of madmen? Or do you think Pearl Harbor was genuinely a complete surprise? So go into your Google Classroom, if you are not there already, find the attached reading and answer the questions and submit them via Google Classroom. As I said before, I don't know yet what everything that's happening right now with the shelter in place and COVID-19, what that means yet for us as a class. But I do know, as of right now, school is still in session. So what does that mean for your grades? I don't know yet. I'm waiting to find out. Once I find out, I will absolutely let you guys know what the expectations are. But I would say that in the meantime, just do the assignments as they come. Try to get as much of it done as possible. I know you guys are under a lot of stress, probably. I understand some of you have jobs. Some of you are being expected to help out around the house more. Some of you might be taking care of your younger siblings. I get it. We all have difficult expectations at home. You guys know I as well. I'm home with my kids and have to take care of them. So, I'm not here to put any pressure on you or to stress you out. I will post assignments at a reasonable pace with videos, and you can watch them or not if you want to. If you're watching this now, I just want you guys to know that I am mindful of your experience living through this. But I want to continue to provide learning opportunities for you. And I hope that you will at least take some time to continue your education at home with my support. And stay tuned for more word officially coming from the district, county, and state level as we decide what the future holds for this school year. All right. Anyway, that being said, I miss you guys. I hope you're all well and safe and healthy and are doing your best to stay busy, stay sane, and using this time to reflect on what it's like to live through a historical moment, much like how probably people felt during and right after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Remember that America has been through major crises before, and we've usually gotten through them by coming out of it better than we did when we came into those crises. And let's try to hope for some positive changes that come out of this huge pause in civilization that is happening right now. All right, I'll see you guys soon, and don't forget to submit your assignments in Google Classroom.